Hello everyone, Teacher Quentin here, and I am going to continue talking about the United Nations 17 Development Goals, or SDGs. Today we are going to focus on goals 12 through 14. If you've missed any other part of our series, you can find them all online where I discuss goals 1 through 12. So without further ado, let's get started with goal number 12. So goal number 12 of the UN's SDGs is responsible consumption and protection. What the UN aims to do is ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Now, what do we mean by this? By this, we mean that the earth is full of natural resources, and we as humans, along with other species, use these natural resources for our survival. But if we do not sustainably consume these resources, and by sustainable we mean use them in a responsible way, then some of these resources can run out or be harmful to other life on Earth. And so the UN's goal for number 12, the 12th goal, is for responsible consumption and to ensure sustainability. So let's look at some details of why this goal is so important. Globally, the material footprint has increased by 70% between 2000 and 2017. So, for every minute, there are 1 million plastic drinking bottles purchased. And each year, 5 trillion single-use plastic bags are thrown away. So, what do we mean by a material footprint? So, a material footprint is the amount of materials that we purchase or use, many of which, if not properly recycled, end up in landfills around the world. Also, in the case of many of our plastic bottles and plastic single-use bags, many of these also end up in the world's oceans. So as we can see, having a large material footprint is not the best situation, because the larger or the more materials that each of us use on a yearly basis, the more trash that the world has to deal with. Also, when we think about waste, we must also think about the electronic waste. So electronic waste continues to proliferate and is not disposed of responsibly. Each person generated about 7.3 kilograms of electronic waste, but only recycled 1.7 kilograms as of 2019. So electronic waste has a lot of dangers because of the chemicals that are involved in that are used to produce many of our electronics. When these chemicals get into the environment, they can cause devastating effects. So when I first mentioned this, I said that electronic waste continues to proliferate. So what does that word mean, proliferate? Well, to proliferate is a bigger word that means to increase rapidly in numbers or multiply. So when I say that electronic waste continues to proliferate, I mean that the amount of electronic waste that each person is producing continues to grow at a rapid or quick pace. Lastly, despite progress, fossil fuel subsidies continue to threaten the achievement of the Paris Agreement and 2030 agenda. So, what do we mean here by fossil fuel subsidies? Now, subsidies is a very important part of what is causing the continued use of so many fossil fuels. So, a subsidy is a sum of money granted by the government or public body to assist an industry or business so that the price of the commodity or service may remain low. So a subsidy is almost like a way that the government tries to help certain industries and tries to keep the price of what that industry is selling low. And so subsidies have been a big reason why fossil fuels continue to be the go-to fuel source for many places, including the United States, because due to subsidies, the fossil fuels are much cheaper than some of the cleaner or greener alternatives such as wind or solar power. Now, many of you may have heard of, and I want to note that we talk about the Paris Agreement. So what is the Paris Climate Agreement? So that climate agreement was an international treaty on climate change, and it was adopted in the year 2015. It covers climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance. So the Paris Climate Agreement was something that many countries around the world got together and agreed that we need to make sustainable changes to the way we protect our environment in order to prevent further climate change. And so based on this agreement, there are certain levels of carbon emissions and certain levels of changes that all of these countries have agreed upon. And so we are still falling short of this agreement and of the target by 2030 due to, in part, by these fuel subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies. All right. So now that we've had a chance to talk about Goal 12, let's move on to Goal 13. Goal 13 of the UN's SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, is for climate action. So the UN hopes with goal number 13 to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So we just mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement, which is something that is very that is helping many countries set goals to mitigate climate change. But let's see exactly why goal number 13 is so important to the UN's SDGs. So we know that the climate crisis continues and is largely unabated. So in 2020, the global average temperature rose at 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial baseline. And by pre-industrial baseline, that means the baseline that was established before the Industrial Revolution, when many of the industries began burning fossil fuels. So that is what we mean by pre-industrial. Now, this is woefully off track to stay at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius change as called for in the Paris Agreement. So we can see that we are already, as of 2020, trending at 1.2 degrees Celsius. And the goal is to stay below 1.5. But if we already are trending at 1.2 and the climate continues to rise, the temperatures, global temperatures continue to rise, we are not far off from that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal that was set in the Paris Agreement. So, a few vocabulary words to think about. Unabated. So we said here that the climate crisis continues largely unabated. So what do we mean by that? Unabated means without any reduction in intensity or strength, meaning that the climate crisis, including the rise in global temperatures, continues despite climate pacts like the Paris Agreement. So this is why we say that it's woefully behind, because the Paris Agreement was made in 2015. So we would think that based on this agreement, our levels in temperature rise would start to reduce by now, 5 years into having the Paris Agreement. But that's not what we're seeing. It is still largely unabated, so has not had any reduction or change in intensity or strength. Also, rising greenhouse gas emissions require shifting economies towards carbon neutrality. So, carbon neutrality is a big term that you will hear many talk about when we think about climate change and mitigating factors or things that we can do to try to decrease climate change and the rise in global climate temperatures. So we all know that carbon dioxide and carbon emissions are one of the key aspects that helps contribute to temperature rise around the globe. Now, carbon neutrality is something that many economies and many countries are trying to move toward, especially as a part of the Paris Agreement. So what is carbon neutrality? This is a very important term. Carbon neutrality means when a person, a company, or a country is carbon neutral, they balance the carbon dioxide they release into the atmosphere through their everyday activities with the amount they absorb or remove from the atmosphere. So essentially, we're talking about having a neutral effect. So let's say that a company or a person puts out, let's just say, 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Well, in order to be carbon neutral, they would then have to remove or absorb 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that their net impact is zero. And so ways that countries or companies typically try to be carbon neutral is by doing things that contribute to the absorption of carbon dioxide. So maybe they might plant trees, for instance, in order to help absorb some of that carbon dioxide. Or maybe they try to shift some of their energy sources from different fuels that burn carbon dioxide, so that by shifting that, they can then hopefully use more of the clean energy, less of the dirty energy, and therefore kind of get back in balance to have a zero net impact. So carbon neutrality is a very important term when we think about climate change and the UN's goal. All right, so our last goal for this video segment will be goal number 14. Goal 14 is life below water. So goal 14 focuses on the world's oceans and what is going on there. And so the 14th goal in the UN's SDGs is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. And so this goes into a lot of different factors when we think about our oceans. It goes into what we put in the oceans, such as chemicals, what we take out of the oceans, such as through fishing and things of that, and food sources that we get out of the ocean. So it's all about how can we sustainably use our oceans in a way that doesn't damage that habitat and the life that lives in the ocean. So let's look at some further details. The sustainability of our oceans is under severe threat. So we can see 5 different things that currently are majorly impacting our oceans. Fishery collapse, plastic and marine pollution, ocean warming, acidification, and eutrophication. All right, so these 5 things are definitely impacting our oceans. So over 3 billion people worldwide rely on oceans for their livelihoods. So this could be anything from fishermen to even people who make a living in some of our tourism type of things, who rely on the ocean for that. But 3 billion people rely on the ocean as part of their livelihood. So let's look at some of these terms. Now, fishery collapse is referring to the fishing industry and overfishing of our waters. So one of the dangers that happens with the ocean environment is us overfishing. So Fish is definitely a very popular food item in many places around the world, and there is a way that we can eat fish and sustainably fish our oceans. But when we overfish the oceans, this can deplete different species of fish, and that depletion of species, it can affect the overall environment in the ocean, because everything depends on something else to keep the environment healthy. And so if we overfish one thing and deplete that resource, that could have effects on other life in the ocean. Plastic and marine pollution. We can think about all of those plastic bottles or single-use plastic bags that end up in our oceans, affecting the plant life and the animal life in the ocean. This could also talk about things like pollution such as oil spills that happen in the ocean and can be deadly to plant life and animal life. Ocean warming. So simply in comparison, and just like we have warming on the Earth's land that we are all experiencing, we also have warming in the world's oceans, and different fish and plant life may die off due to the high temperatures that can no longer sustain their life in the ocean. And now, two other terms that many of us may not be familiar with are the acidification and the eutrophication of the world's oceans. So let's look at those two terms. So, eutrophication, that is the excessive richness of nutrients in a lake or other body of water, frequently due to runoff from the land, which causes dense growth of plant life and death of animal life from lack of oxygen. So, we would normally think that something that helps grow plant life would be a good thing. But what we must understand is that for the world, everything does better in good balance. And so when we have a dense overgrowth of plant life in our oceans or lakes, the plants take up oxygen out of the water that then the animals rely on, like the fish and other sea animals that rely on the oxygenated water. Now these plants are taking up some of that oxygen and making it difficult for those animals to survive. So that is why this is actually a problem, and is often caused, as I said, by runoff into the ocean or lakes. So runoff meaning when it rains and the rain falls on the concrete or other man-made surfaces, and then that goes into the drainage systems, into the sewers, and then eventually makes its way out to our rivers into oceans. And that can change the plant life and the nutrients that are in those bodies of water. Next, let's talk about acidification. Acidification is the ongoing decrease in pH value of the Earth's ocean. So it's causing the oceans to become more acidic, have a higher acid level in the water. And that is caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The main cause of ocean acidification are human activities, namely the burning of fossil fuels. So again, we always usually think about the burning of fossil fuels as having an impact to the land or air temperatures that we experience on Earth, but those same carbon dioxide and carbon emissions have an impact even on our oceans, changing the very chemical makeup of the water of those oceans. And when the water becomes too acidic, again, this can cause a death in plant life and animal life. So this is why goal number 14 is so important. Now, over half of key marine biodiversity areas are not protected. So this is just a very staggering statistic, because we know that over half of areas that are very biodiverse are not protected from these dangers like overfishing, pollution, acidification. So these areas are not protected at all. And so there are no regulations, no laws to help protect these areas. Over 50%, over half of marine biodiversity areas. So this is why it's so important for us to become knowledgeable and to try to help with these issues so that we can continue to use our oceans and have a healthy environment for years to come. All right, and biodiversity, just as one last key word, biodiversity is the variety of life in the world and in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So we want our oceans and even our forests and lands to have biodiversity. We want them to have a variety of life. And the ways our human behaviors are impacting biodiversity has been traditionally in a negative way. And so the UN, with these goals, with these sustainable development goals, this is a way that we can begin to have a more positive impact on our environment. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to our this video in our series of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has developed. Stay tuned for our next video, which will cover goals 15 through 17, the last 3 sustainable goals. Thank you. We'll see you next time.